think it's also a perception point, getting away from the idea that data centers are a barrier to decarbonisation, because they're not. As I said, they can help spread the fixed costs that are absolutely vital to building more grid.
But I think we really need to identify those regions and identify what class of generating and grid support capacity the TSO, the government and the local community want to see there, and then use data centres as an anchor tenant revenue asset to make that investment feasible.
Data centres can be great for us, great for the country, great for growth. So if we do this well, then this should see a reduction in bills for domestic customers and also for other business customers.
Artificial intelligence, hyperscale computing, and data centers are driving a new wave of electricity demand. In this episode, we explore what AI means for the power system of the future and how it could shape the energy transition. For this episode in the summer series, we're looking at AI and data centers. How power hungry are they? And I'm delighted to be joined by Katie Berriman-Davies.
Thank you for having me.
And Liam Newcomb.
Thank you. Good to see you again.
Across Europe, where are you seeing the strongest demand for new AI and hyperscale data centers? And what factors are now driving these decisions beyond simply finding available land and power?
Places with fast access to power and similarly fast planning are some of the Nordic markets. The Nordic regions have historically had very good, very strong energy policy. They've got very strong grids with nuclear, hydro, lots of other very reliable dispatchable generation. And they also have relatively low power costs. They're very low by European standards, relatively low by rest of world standards.
Turning to the UK, Katie, what's the situation there?
I mean, we've seen a huge influx in data center applications to the electricity grid over the last year, well, a couple of years, but mainly over the last year, particularly in response to the AI growth zone announcement from the government. So that is trying to incentivize the clustering of data center projects in specific zones. And the incentives range from faster planning to faster grid connections and lower energy costs in certain regions. I think it's very important to note that the huge surge in applications does not necessarily translate to real viable projects. So the demand queue across transmission and distribution at the moment is 125 gigawatts. NESO has identified 50 gigawatts of data centers, but industry estimates has the real figure, so viable projects that will reach energization at between 8 to 12. So much lower than the 50 gigawatts figure that's been flying around headlines recently. And that's because of speculation. So where applications are submitted in the off chance that a project might be built there, or multiple applications are submitted for the same project. So that's why there are reforms going through government, NESO and Ofgem at the moment to try and tackle some of that speculation in the queue.
I mean, I think those reforms are crucial here, isn't it? Because you separate the serious applications from perhaps the speculative ones, as you said. And how do you do that? I mean, how can you process this backlog?
You can imagine Tech UK represents 90% of the data center sector in the UK, so it's of paramount importance to our membership. Ofgem, NESO and DESNZ are looking at 3 different pillars as part of demand connections reform. So the first is curate, and that is essentially trying to weed out speculative projects from the queue. Then there's also the plan pillar, the second pillar, which is trying to ensure that there's some strategy when we're connecting projects to the grid. So previously, demand has only had to be ready and not needed, but now there's going to be strategic alignment. So projects that are seen as absolutely vital to the economy, that deliver significant social benefits, they will see accelerated connection times. And then there's the connect pillar. So that's looking at more operational solutions. So for example, data centers building their own high voltage infrastructure, operating on the independent transmission owner model, which up until now has only been available for distribution networks, but whether we extend that to transmission networks and the various secondary legislation or class exemptions that might be required as part of a build and transfer model where data centers build the infrastructure and then hand it over to the transmission owner. There's also some focus on ramp connections. So where instead of securing the max capacity initially, the data center will build out in stages and that connection size will increase over years. There's also quite a lot of discussion around flexibility, which is a sensitive topic, I must say, around the sector. So also very happy to delve into that, but it's separate but linked to connection reform. I think that the subject of flexibility is frequently being debated across jurisdictions, not just the UK, but it's now being brought into connection reforms discussion in the UK as well.
Liam, what's the experience here in other jurisdictions in other parts of Europe in terms of tackling this backlog?
A few transmission system operators who are sort of clearly out in front in terms of their response to the market. You have Airgrid, who have traditionally been a leader, largely because they operate a relatively small network with a lot of data center load on it with very limited interconnection. So they don't have the ability to lean on cross-border connectors. So it becomes quite a lot more difficult to run that network reliably and at an acceptable cost for bill payers. And that's the key thing, is that the TSOs are charged with doing things at minimum cost, not maximum quality for data centers. So Airgrid have gone a long way with the CRU, the Commission for Regulation of Utilities in Ireland. And essentially now, if you want to build a large data center in Ireland, you have to go and build a renewable energy hub, either as the data center developer or in collaboration with somebody else. They've also brought in some very interesting market shaping in that regulation. So as we understand it at the moment, you're expected to place dispatchable generation either in the form of thermal or at some derating factor battery into the capacity mechanism. So that's a very specific and deliberate move to stop data center demand on the network driving up basic bill prices by pushing up capacity market prices. If you bring your own generation, you're providing the matching cover that the TSO is then required to buy. It's also arguably a much more efficient overall use of asset. If data centers have thermal firming capacity, it makes a lot of sense to share that with the network rather than competing with the network for the same turbines and the same fuel to electricity conversion. At the other end, we've got people like Fingrid with absolutely superb network data available. You can just go onto Fingrid's website and see exactly what capacity they have at which supply points and distribution points.
I'd like to just turn back to what, Katie, you mentioned flexibility. Now, it's obviously this is a very important part of the discussion going forward. Where is the UK today and how does this fit into sort of the wider grid connection reform?
The UK is in the process of developing a demand capacity register, which I believe is meant to fulfill the same objectives as in Finland. So on flexibility, I think it's first important to note that data centers are committed to being good grid citizens. There are some operational difficulties if you're talking about load shifting or curtailment. So most data centers will have very strict SLAs, service level agreements, that require 5 nines power availability.
Now, the UK has some of the highest industrial electricity prices, certainly in Europe, if not globally. How much is that affecting investment into the country, and what kind of policy changes do you think could improve
the AI training workloads? That's a prime example of where the UK is not attracting specific types of workloads, because AI training is very price sensitive but location agnostic. So just as one example from a paper I read recently, Social Market Foundation, powering a 100 megawatt data center costs £220 million per year in the UK compared to 56 million in the US and 67 million in Sweden. So that's why we're not attractive for AI training. It simply doesn't make economic sense for projects to locate here. And I think historically our bills have been so high because gas sets the price of electricity. That is falling due to more renewables coming online, bringing down the wholesale price and decreasing the frequency with which gas sets the price of electricity. So That was around 100% of the time, and it's now around 80%. So we're seeing some really positive developments from the decarbonisation of our grid. I think what we're increasingly seeing is non-commodity costs adding up on bills. So these are costs to fund network build-out. There are also costs to fund government schemes. So, for example, renewables obligation or the feed-in tariff, where we're subsidising legacy renewables projects. And they're very important schemes to fund, but they together have added £11 billion to bills over 2025 to 26.
I'd like to round off now and time to get the crystal ball out so to look ahead 5 to 10 years. What does a successful European AI infrastructure strategy look like in your view?
I don't think socially we can afford to get into a position where data centers are perceived as being treated as special over any other type of business or residential consumer. We'll lose our social license to operate very quickly in that sort of circumstance. And I think what we'll need to do, recognizing that central strip of Europe that's largely dependent on wind and nuclear and other relatively high cost forms of generation, isn't going to compete on unit price with the Nordics or with the solar and wind resources of the Iberian Peninsula. So we have location, we have major metro areas that need local cloud zones, etc. So to some extent, we're going to deploy classes of workload in the regions that they're well suited to. It doesn't mean we're going to build fewer data centers in United Kingdom or Germany, etc. It means we're going to deploy data centers regionally based on the requirement. But also, as we've discussed, there are ways to get those bills down. One of the areas that we really need to improve the planning and policy complexity and certainty on is the ability to do things like behind the meter transactions. So a CPPA over the network, yes, fine, it'll lock in some power price for you. Even if you're a small operator, there are people like Zendo out there who will go and wrap that up for you so that you don't have to take on that complexity. And I think that's a real growing market as well. But for the sort of size sites we build, 100 megawatts and up, realistically, I'm going to go and partner with one of the energy majors to have very large wind or solar resources nearby. It's a site selection criteria for me because I'm not in central Paris. I'm sitting outside somewhere. If I have the regulatory certainty that I can do enough of that behind the meter, I can create very attractive pricing for tenants to come and land in that data center. If it's done as part of a combined, so for example, if we look 5 years forward into AI growth zone policy and assume that the government, the TSOs and the data center developers get together along with the energy majors, we can say we can identify regions of the country where we're not going to be building directly adjacent to housing or other friction elements and actually develop combined demand, grid support and generation assets where we can locally bring costs down. And I think a key part of that, we're looking at this in Northern Ireland at the moment, is that a lot of the transmission and distribution networks are at very low utilization at the moment. And as Katie pointed to, it's the non-commodity costs that are crippling across that central band of Europe. And that doesn't go away as we go into sort of wind and similar renewables because we're looking at shipping power thousands of kilometers to do that. What we actually need to do there is not just locate demand closer to the generation, but also make the demand flexible so that we can take away some of the necessary safety threshold that the transmission operators have to operate to. So in data center world, we design the cooling system for the hottest hour of a 20-year period with a little bit of headroom on top to make sure the data center doesn't fail. Grid operators do a very similar thing. They look at their worst possible hour on their worst possible day and say, do we have the network to do it if everything goes wrong at the same time? In those cases, I think actually allowing data centers to access a less firm, maybe not a fully non-firm, but a firm with specific constraint periods, that allows the data center to get built. And if I can go and build a wind farm, a solar farm, a big battery, something else to support it, then I can get my power cost for my tenant down. Ideally, I am allowed to spill some of that renewable energy, which I'm getting at a very fixed price, to local consumers. At the moment, that's deemed to be market manipulation. But if I build a data center in, for example, Derry, and I have spare wind power, why can I not spill my spare wind power to the people of Derry and give them some of the cheap power my tenant isn't using? That seems obtruse to me, and it's very hard to explain to local people why there are good reasons for the grid rules that prevent that. But also, by putting those data center loads in place, we can bring average utilization up on the power networks. So rather than being a stressor and requiring huge quantities of decades-long investment that drive up all of the core non-commodity charges, I think what we need to do is work with the TSOs, move from the old analog grid dispatch through digital to rapidly software-defined and responsive facilities, so that the TSOs can manage those as modern networks with EV charging, data centers, and all the other assets, and get that utilization up. And then we get the unit cost of each megawatt capacity of transmission backbone down. So it's complex and it's multidisciplinary, but I think we really need to identify those regions and identify what class of generating and grid support capacity the TSO, the government, and the local community want to see there, and then use data centers as an anchor tenant revenue asset to make that investment feasible.
Communication is of the essence here, and also and across all these different stakeholders. It's very reassuring. We've heard of some of the challenges, but also a lot of solutions from you guys. But just a final question for you, Katie, if you can sort of briefly summarize, if we were having this conversation in 5 years' time, what would success look like for the UK?
It would be data centers being able to connect to the electricity grid, I think, in brief, because there's a lot of conversation around data centers' potential negative impacts. So whether that's increasing prices for everyone or leading to increased use of dirtier generation, whether that's, gas or diesel. But a lot of these issues could be solved by allowing the market to do what it does best and react to investment and locational signals, ensuring that we have a flourishing CPPA market where data centers can actually lead to additionality, that additional renewable energy coming on the grid. As Liam mentioned, trying to overcome some of those regulatory glitches that are currently getting in the way of a stronger, more cohesive relationship between clean energy and data centers. And I think I think it's also a perception point, getting away from the idea that data centers are a barrier to decarbonisation, because they're not. As I said, they can help spread the fixed costs that are absolutely vital to building more grid. And a decarbonised grid is also a decentralised grid. So if we have these costs spread over a shrinking base of consumers, everyone's seeing their bills increases, and they're increasingly going to point the finger at data centers because that's what a lot of the media would tell them to do. So I think it's trying to engage both the energy and tech sectors and understand solutions that work for everyone. And actually, it's so important to have both sides of the equation sat down at a table and working together on solutions rather than discussions happening in silos. So get data centers connected to the grid and allow them to be facilitators of the energy transition rather than getting in the way of that.
Perfect. And what a great place to end. So Katie and Liam, thank you very much for being guests in this episode of the summer series of Plugged In. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Katie and Liam have outlined both the scale of the opportunity and the policy changes needed to support it. But what does all of this look like from the perspective of the electricity system itself? To find out, I spoke to Steve Smith, Chief Strategy Officer at National Grid, about whether today's networks are ready for the rapid growth of AI and data centers and the investments needed to keep pace. We've heard in this episode that the data center connection queue is heavily oversubscribed with many speculative applications alongside genuine projects. So how confident confident are you that the current reforms will separate viable demand from speculation? And what remains the biggest obstacle to getting major projects connected more quickly, Steve?
Well, I think before we get onto the reforms, a good place to start is the plan. So what we've just signed off with Ofgem, our regulator, is our sort of investment plans for the next 5 years. And as part of that, we are committed to connecting about 10 gigawatts of data centers, which is a huge, huge number compared to what we have today. And they'll be connected both directly to our transmission system, but also to the distribution networks as well that hang off our distribution system. So it's just worth saying we start from a very good place. That is a huge increase in the volume of data centers. So really the cue is about, what are we going to do beyond the next 5 years? And can we do any more within those 5 years? So can we go beyond the plan we already have?
There's a growing view that data centers shouldn't just consume power. They should also actively support the grid through flexibility, storage, and even their own generation. What does a good, if you like, data center look like from the national grid perspective?
So, I mean, if we do this well, data centers can be great for us, great for the country, great for growth. So we all know that AI is a huge growth area, so can be really good for the economy. But it can also be good for other users of our network. So essentially think of our network of a big fixed cost network. So these users bring massive amounts of volume to our network and they pay for the volume they put across our network. So if we do this well, then this should see a reduction in bills for domestic customers and also for other business customers. Now, that hinges on when they connect that we don't need to do lots of investment on our networks to connect them. So that gets back to your question, what does a good data center look like? A good data center is one that can offer us some flexibility. So what do I mean by flexibility? Well, in essence, our transmission system's only really stressed for a handful of hours a year. It's in the winter peaks when everyone's trying to use power at the same time. So if they can show us a bit of flexibility around those hours, typically we can connect them to our system without the need for heavy investment in new lines or anything else. And that's where things like them having batteries on their side of the fence, or them having some generation just to cope with those peak hours, or increasingly being able to flex how much power they take. And I can talk a bit more about that. That's what a good data center looks like. And that gets us into this virtuous circle where data centers are great for everyone else because they're paying for a significant proportion of our costs. And that means lower bills for everyone else.
But they're not that flexible though, are they? In essence, I mean, they can't really ramp down and up again. I mean, that's not the essence of them as demand centers.
So I think that's been the view for a long time. We've been doing some really interesting work with a company called Emerald AI. So this is a company that we and NVIDIA invested in a couple of years ago, coming out of the US. And they've built basically a software algorithm which you can put in data centers. And we trialed it in the UK a couple of months ago. And we're actually seeing that these large data centers can flex. So typically at any point in time, if we say to them, is there any of your load that's not absolutely vital? Could you just shift it by a couple of hours? Then the answer is yes. So we've got plans to take what was a fairly limited trial to a much bigger trial on a really substantial data center in the UK to prove that. So I think the way you described it, certainly the way we were all thinking a couple of years ago, but we're now starting to see, potentially technology playing a role in helping the data centers to provide that flexibility.
I mean, that could potentially be a game changer.
Absolutely. And as you can tell, we're very excited about it. It's why we invested in the company. And I think Varun, who's the CEO, and I are, out saying, look, this is exactly that. It is a game changer.
We also talked in this episode about certain countries that are very attractive for investors in terms of, lower competitive, if you like, power prices, but also the other conditions. How can the UK remain competitive with other countries, either in northern and Scandinavia or in southern Europe, like, for example, the Iberian Peninsula?
So look, what are the companies trying to do this care about? They care about, quality of the workforce, and there the UK starts really strongly. I mean, AI, began life and the big breakthroughs we've seen with companies like, DeepMind and Demis Hassabis, who obviously still based in London. There is this massive ecosystem of London AI-based startups. We're moving beyond large language models to material science to physical AI. So that's one of the big pluses for the UK. And if you talk to the big the big US players, that's one of the things that attracts them to us. As you said, one of the downsides is sadly we have some of the highest electricity prices. That's not so good. And so where we can get that competitive advantage is for them, I think it's all about speed to power. They are in an arms race to build these models as fast as they can. They're all competing with each other. So if we can actually say we can connect you faster than anyone else, and that's where companies like Emerald AI and companies like GridCare we're working with. So that's our mission at National Grid, is to say, how do we create that competitive advantage for the UK by saying we can get you on faster than anywhere else? Then you can exploit that, really talented ecosystem and labour force that we have in the UK. And hopefully that makes you think, well, even though your energy prices are high, that compensates for that. And therefore we'd rather be in the UK than elsewhere.
You mentioned the 10 gigawatts that's being brought online over the next 5 years, Steve. What is supply? Is supply able to meet that kind of demand? Is it, or does it need to catch up?
The sort of irony, or the thing you have to get your head around with electricity systems is they're only stressed for a small number of hours. So, we have, maybe 100 hours when the system's close to peak, and that's when, your generation capacity is stretched. For most of the rest of the year, so for the other 8,660 hours of the year, and particularly if you think, during the summer months, overnight, there's lots and lots of generation. So it's really only those peak periods. In the UK, as we've moved to a predominantly renewable system, we've still got, all the gas-fired plant, the nuclear, the gas-fired plant acts as backup. And then we've also, National Grid owns, 7 interconnectors that connect us to various European countries. There are other companies, so we got 10 interconnectors in total. So we don't think there's a generation problem. We think we've got, the flexibility. We've also got lots of batteries coming onto the system. And as I said, even if there is, it's really only about that sort of handful of hours, where, as I said, we can import from other countries or use batteries to just meet those peaks.
What role does strategic planning and reformed national pricing, what does that mean for data center location? Should they be closer to generation sites?
There is a huge prize. We have areas of the country where, if we can encourage data centers to go there, where it's close to the generation, particularly to the offshore wind, that reduces the need for us to, build new transmission lines, build new capacity. So that would always be our first preference. But we recognize, that in some senses, the customer's always right. There are other reasons why they might not be able to do that. So it's kind of a bit of push and pull, if you like. So we'd like to sort of make those opportunities available to people and say, look, if you locate there, it'll be really beneficial. We can basically offer you discounted network rates, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the reality is that we'll get a bit of a mix. We'll get some people who are willing to move and able to, and others who aren't. And at the end of the day, our job is to do what our customers want, and so we'll meet both needs. But again, that flexibility is key. Even if they're locating further away from demand, the more they can be flexible, then the more we can use the network we have. I mean, one of the things it's worth remembering there, we do have a network that has quite a lot of spare capacity on the demand side on it. So it was a system that was built for peak demand of about 65 gigawatts today because of, changes like energy efficiency, because we've now got a lot more, rooftop solar, things like that. Our system actually only does a peak about 45 gigawatts. So there is spare capacity on the network. So if we can get that flexibility, get them in the right places, then as I said, we can use that spare capacity and not need to build, more capacity. And that's where it has that great impact on other people's rates and bills.
There's certainly a very key word there, that flexibility there. But if we look ahead to 10 years, Steve, what investments need to happen now? I mean, in network storage, the word flexibility and generation to ensure that AI-driven demand strengthens rather than destabilizes the energy transition more widely.
So, I mean, if I talk about, our business and transmission, and we are embarking on a once in a generation or probably once in 3 generation investment program, which is already underway. So we're calling it the Great Grid Upgrade. So it'll be, the biggest build out of the transmission system since, it was first constructed back in the post-war era. So we're committed to spending, of the order of £40 billion on our networks over the next sort of 5 to 6 years. Most of that will be in transmission. And a lot of that is because if you think about it, our system was built for a different world, the coal-fired, gas-powered power stations, the old nuclear plants. Everything we've connected to date and everything that's coming, the offshore wind, the new batteries are in different places. So we're having to build out our network both onshore and increasingly offshore to connect up, the large wind farms that have already connected, but the large wind farms that are still to connect, and the batteries, that we'll need. So it is already underway. We've broken ground there. There are 17 major projects we're involved in. We've broken ground on 3 of them. And, that will be our major focus over the next 5 years, to just deliver all of those projects on budget, on time, hopefully if we can ahead of time, ahead of budget, so that we've got the system we need to connect up all that renewable generation and storage.
Well, best of luck with that, Steve. And thank you very much for being a guest on this episode of the Plugged In podcast.
You're welcome, and lovely to talk to you, Richard.
And to you listeners, thanks for listening to this episode of Plugged In. If you enjoyed this discussion, please like, rate, and follow to make sure you get the latest podcast episodes as soon as we release them every Thursday. Finally, you can head to montelnews.com for more news and analysis from our team of journalists across Europe and beyond. See you next time.